Looking at this slide, it's identical nearly to what we just read, but some minor differences in details. Rapture on the left side in yellow. Jesus comes on or with the clouds, right? Borrowing language that goes all the way back to Daniel chapter 7, where he said, I'm going to come on the Son of Man, Daniel saw, coming on the clouds, approaching the Ancient of Days to receive his kingdom. So he comes on or with the clouds. That clouds language is picked up by Yeshua in Matthew 24. It's carried over into Matthew 26, where he stands before Caiaphas, and he says, you are going to see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds. He talks about the Son of Man coming on the clouds in other places. So coming with the clouds, coming on the clouds is a common motif. But contrasted to that is when you read through the book of Revelation, chapter 20, I believe this time, or 19 or 18, somewhere. I think it could go earlier back as 16. I apologize for not knowing exactly which chapter it is. 16, 17, 18. That part of the book of Revelation has always been a little bit fuzzy to me, but I know what happens. I just don't know exactly which chapter it is. But the point germane to my study is that the second coming is described where Yeshua comes back on a white horse, and the armies of heaven, it uses that language, armies of heaven are following him also on white horses. Jesus comes on a horse, and the armies of heaven are also on white horses, and it's the description of his coming to destroy the Antichrist at the Battle of Armageddon, where all of Satan's armies are massed together to do battle against Jerusalem and to finally try to wipe her off the map. Jesus comes on a horse, which is contrasted with him coming on the clouds in the rapture language. So in the rapture, Jesus stops in midair and we meet him. In the second coming, notice this time I'm bouncing back and forth between each category instead of just reading all of them in one shot. Contrast this with Jesus comes completely onto the earth in the second coming. He touches down. His feet touch the ground in the Zechariah passage, and in John's Revelation, he sees the Lamb standing on Mount Zion. So that corresponds with the second coming. In the rapture aspect or timing or time frame, Jesus brings his people up to himself, and in the second coming, Jesus brings his people down with him. So one popular author said, the saints go up and the wrath comes down. All right. In the rapture, keep going. In the rapture, God's people get their glorified bodies, right? That's the mystery of the rapture, the mystery of that was hidden from the Old Testament saints, which kind of, as I interject, when Paul says in Thessalonians that this was a mystery, or in Corinthians, I can't remember which passage where he talks about, behold, I tell you a mystery. I think it might be the Corinthians. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. I think that's a Corinthian passage. 1 Corinthians 15, somewhere around there. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. This mystery that Paul revealed is that when we talk about biblical mysteries, we're talking about something that is known to God alone in its fullness, but hinted at or given at in seminal form, or kind of what we might call ambiguous fashion, or kind of unclear terms, fuzzy terminology in the Old Testament. So it's a truth that was hidden from the Old Testament saints, but it is a truth that God knows. So it's not mysterious in the sense that no one can know it. Rather, it's a mystery that was hidden by God from the Old Testament, a time frame in the Old Testament time frame, only to be revealed after the incarnation and the coming of Yeshua into the world. So we got a good number of mysteries in the Bible, a handful at least, half a dozen: mystery of Christ, mystery of God, mystery of salvation, mystery of the Gentiles, mystery of the rapture. The mystery of the resurrection is that we who are alive will be caught up to meet the Lord in the air. So resurrection itself is not a mystery. It was foretold even in Daniel. Right? Look it up. Daniel was foretold around Revelation chapter 12 that the saints will be resurrected. They'll be raised, right? Even Job said, with my flesh I will see God. So resurrection was foretold in the Old Testament. That's not the mystery, really. The mystery is that included with the bringing in of the Gentiles as part of the mystery of the gospel, the inclusion of the church, is that there will be some people alive who will be caught up and they'll be transformed in the twinkling of an eye. That's the mystery part of the resurrection. So resurrection from the dead, not quite mysterious, but being changed as if you were still alive, that's a mystery. So people get their glorified bodies. Who? Both the dead who are resurrected, which wasn't quite a mystery, and those who are alive who will be changed in the moment of the twinkling of an eye. That's the mystery part. So in the second coming, by contrast, God's people already have glorified bodies as they're riding on white horses. There's no mystery, bodies changing, all that stuff transforming, that's not happening at the second coming. That's the language that's given to us in second coming. Again, the reason I brought up the word mystery is because in the Old Testament, in the Tanakh, when we look at Jesus' return, that's being foretold by prophets such as Daniel and Isaiah and Zechariah and things like that, because his return is itself a mystery. When we say his, we're talking about the resurrected Messiah and the incarnation of God in flesh returning to planet Earth. All of that is shrouded in mystery, and yet resurrection from our part is not mystery, but the fact that Christ himself was a mystery in the Old Testament. Right? The Messiah, the fact that he would be God on earth, God dwelling among men, that he would come into the world and suffer and die and then go to heaven. A lot of that was mysterious, not language that we could put our finger on in the time period of Enoch. Because of that, it makes sense that when we look at the Old Testament, that we're talking about one return. Daniel was shown in Daniel chapter 7, one coming of the Son of Man, approaching on the clouds, approaching the Ancient of Days. There are not two comings, they're not two parousias, there's only one. And that makes sense. But when we zoom in using the lens of the New Testament, and we now realize that this one single event known as the coming or the return was actually broken up into two aspects or two bookends. The rapture, which is that really part of the mystery part, and then the second coming, which is not really quite the mystery part. Then it makes perfect sense. And one last point I'll make, and then I'll just begin to wrap this part of my study up, because we're talking about who is taken and who is left behind. We're talking about this time frame of the end. When we look at these two charts in front of us, rapture on the left in yellow, second coming in blue on the right, the rapture primarily deals with who? The church. Who is the church? It is primarily the Gentile believers in this age, in this pause that we call the times of the Gentiles, this gap that we're living in between the time when Yeshua left planet Earth in the first century and the time when he will return in our century, which I believe it is this century, but I'm not being dogmatic, but seems like we're fast approaching. So in this gap, the times of the Gentiles that we're living in, this age of the church, when he comes to rapture the believers, it is primarily an event that involves snatching the church out of the jaws of the great tribulation that will be raging on as a result of the intense wrath of Satan incarnate, aka the Antichrist, which happens during what I would call the Great Tribulation. And so if you look at this, rapture primarily deals with the church, but by comparison, unredeemed Israel, right? Unbelieving Israel has to go through the brunt of not just the wrath of Satan, i.e. the tribulation, but they also have to go through the wrath of God that's poured out in the trumpet and bowl judgments that the church is said to be exempt from. So when we talk about who is the church and who is Israel, and how is there an overlap using a Venn diagram that looks like a MasterCard logo where two circles come close together, kiss one another, and overlap and create an almond slice in the middle between the two halves. We talk about the church on one side and Israel on the other side, and when we overlap the two, we have the remnant of Israel, which is known as the church, which is the slice of believers in our time frame that are made up of Christian, Jewish, Gentile believers as well as Jewish believers. The rapture deals primarily in that mystery aspect because it deals with snatching away the very mysterious part of the whole Bible, which is the church. The church was a mystery hidden from the Old Testament saints. They couldn't see the Gentiles coming in to Israel as fellow heirs and taking their place right alongside Jewish believers as co-equal inheritors of the kingdom of God. They couldn't see that because it was a mystery. It's what's known as by Paul in the book of Ephesians as the mystery of the gospel. The mystery of the gospel, or elsewhere he talks about it as the mystery of the Gentiles. It's the bringing of the Gentiles in as fellow heirs along with the believing Jewish remnant. That's the mystery. Well, the rapture primarily snatches those folks away. But who does it leave behind? It doesn't only leave behind the wicked of humanity, the Gentiles who do not believe in God, but the rapture leaves behind unbelieving Israel. Yeah, that's right. Unbelieving Israel gets left behind to continue to go through the wrath of Satan, aka the Great Tribulation, but also to go through the wrath of God. They're not exempt from the wrath of God, like the church is exempt from the wrath of God. In other words, Israel has to go through the wrath of God in order to be refined and purified and purged of her unbelief, so that the remnant that survives through the wrath of God comes out at the end of the week, into the seventh week, ready to look upon him whom they've pierced, using the Zechariah language, the Zechariah prophecy in Zechariah 12, 13, 14, and using the language that Yeshua carried in his Matthew 24, Olivet Discourse, where he said, all the tribes of the earth will mourn. So they will look upon me, Yeshua says, but only after they've been brought to their knees, right? What did Yeshua say the chapter earlier, Matthew chapter 23 at the very end? Look at you, Israel. I'm paraphrasing. I wanted to gather you like a mother hen gathers her chicks, but you wouldn't have it. So I tell you what, your house, meaning the temple, is going to be left to you desolate, and you're not going to see me again until you cry out, Baruch haba Shem Adonai. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, right? I'm preaching now. I'm preaching to unbelieving Israel. I'm going to leave, and you're not going to see me again until you're ready to receive me. And when will that happen? Not during the rapture. It won't happen then. They won't be ready yet. They have to go through a lot more crap in order to be purified, in order to bring into what Daniel was given in chapter 9 of all of these bringing in everlasting righteousness, sealing up the vision, the prophecy, and the anointing of the most holy, and to establishing of the kingdom. So that's not going to happen until the second coming. So that's why we have these two different events that are kind of separated by some events that'll take place that are still part of Yeshua's coming. In other words, as we're going to see as we keep moving forward with this, the coming of Messiah is equated with the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord events are the coming of Messiah, but he doesn't have to actually be here on planet Earth in order to execute all of these wrath of God, day of the Lord judgments that are marked in the book of Revelation as the trumpet judgments and the bowl judgments that we'll read about eventually, starting in Revelation chapter 8 and working our way through to about Revelation chapter 16. So let me finish this list. So rapture, God's people get their glorified bodies. Second coming, God's people have their glorified bodies. Rapture, judgment, and the wrath of God begin with the 7 trumpets and 7 bowls as the wicked of mankind are allowed 3.5 years. Yeah, I kind of follow along with that. Judgment and the wrath of God begin with the rapture and the 7 trumpets, not the 7 seals. That goes all the way back to the beginning of the 7th week with what Yeshua called the beginning of birth pangs, or the beginning of sorrows in other versions of the Bible, like KJV or something like that. But the second coming has the judgment and wrath being concluded at the Battle of Armageddon and the end of the wicked from this earth, where, moving with our chart here, the rapture has the Antichrist and the false prophet are allowed 3.5 more years, right? Middle of the week, going towards the end of the week. The rapture takes place somewhere around the middle of the week, sometime into the middle of the week, according to what I believe the pre-wrath view teaches, right? So at least the Antichrist and the false prophet are allowed 42 months, 3.5 years, 1,260 days, times and half a time, according to that chart that we looked at earlier, which was given all the way back in the book of Daniel, but picked up again 5 more times in the book of Revelation. But then, by comparison, second coming, the Antichrist and false prophet are captured and cast into the lake of fire. The devil's captured and sealed in the bottomless pit for 1,000 years. So, in conclusion to this section, as we look at David Guzik finish his, and then I'll show you 2 more slides, and we'll call it quits for tonight for this particular segment. So, the dilemma is resolved by seeing that there are actually 2 second comings. This is Guzik speaking. I don't believe two comings is the best language. I rather would think that the Bible's talking about one coming, one parousia in the Greek, right? One arrival, but earmarked by a bookend on the front, which we would call rapture, and a bookend on the end that we would call second coming. But it's one event known as the second coming. In other passages of the Bible, it's one event known as the day of the Lord. In other passages, it's one event known as the day of Christ. It's one event known as the wrath of God in the book of Revelation. So it's one coming, going all the way back to Tanakh. One coming, one event where Daniel saw the Son of Man approaching the Ancient of Days. And yet, because of the mystery aspect, the rapture was hidden from the Old Testament readers, which means unbelieving Israel today who's not reading the New Testament, right? Unrepentant Israel, Israel who's in rebellion against Jesus. So we're talking about rabbinic Judaism and those forms of Judaism who are even interested in religion. So we're not talking about secular Jews, just even the religious Jews, right? Orthodox Jews, etc., etc. They're still not reading the New Testament. They're primarily stuck in the Tanakh. So what? They're going to miss the rapture because it's part of that hidden aspect. It's part of that mystery. They're not understanding that the church is part of Israel, been grafted into Israel, right? Romans chapter 11. They don't understand that aspect, so they're going to miss that. They're still in the dark. They're going to be part of that crowd that misses the rapture, and therefore the rapture is going to happen like a thief in the night, and the second coming at the end, unless they are brought into that time of repentance, they make it through that, they're also going to miss the second coming altogether. So Guzik tells that this dilemma is solved by the two comings. He says the contradictions in Matthew 24 and much of the rest of prophecy are often solved by seeing that there are really references to two returns. But I don't see two returns. I would rather say that there's one return, one parousia, but two bookends. And then he goes on and talks about, therefore you also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour do you not expect. And I've already kind of read that part, so I don't have to highlight anything there about the fact that he's coming at an hour that you do not expect. That language in conclusion, I believe, must be more of a reference to rapture when he's talking about the day, no man knows the day or the hour. That must be rapture because according to Daniel and according to Revelation, we do know that at least the day that Yeshua's second coming takes place, it's either at the end of the 1260 days, at the end of the 1290 days, or at the end of the 1335 days. It's one of those three when the second coming happens. Why? Because Daniel, through an angel no less, was already given that time frame where we can start from the midpoint of the week and work our way to the end of the 70th week with certainty down to the day. Contrary to what Yeshua said in Matthew, where he says, no man knows the day, not me, and not the angels, only Papa. So this tells me that we must be dealing with rapture versus second coming. So now we didn't get to Tim Hague yet. We'll deal with that next week, but I'll finalize with this chart at the end. Notice, what do we have now? What's the conclusion to our dilemma about taking and left? Jesus says, two will be in the field, one will be taken, one will be left. Two will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken, one will be left. And when we look at the Luke rendering, there's two men in the bed, one will be taken, one will be left. What are we to make of this? This chart was supplied by, I think it's what is his name? I can't remember his name, but if I remember it, I'll tell you. But it was he's a very well-known Bible prophecy teacher, and in his teaching, he summarized the rapture and the second coming in a very easy to understand language. It's a summary of really those two charts that we were looking at earlier, but it uses the take and left verbiage to help us understand the differences. In the rapture, which was part of the mystery that Paul talked about, either in Corinthians or in the Thessalonians, I apologize, I don't remember which reference it is. It's either 1 Corinthians 15 or it's 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. It's one of those two. But I think it's the Thessalonian passage myself. I'll look it up after the study's over. In the rapture, Christians are taken and the wicked are left. Why does he believe that? Because the language, and we're going to see this when we get to Tim Hague, the language suggests that the taken in the context is taken unto rescue, taken unto rapture, taken unto Yeshua to escape the danger. And the taken word is the word, the paralambano word in the Greek, is the word used to refer to being rescued out of the sphere of danger. Christians are taken and the wicked are left. In other words, Tim LaHaye got it right. in that aspect. In the left behind books, those who are left behind are not the Christians. Those who are left behind are those who are the unbelievers. Or to go back to Matthew chapter 13 and Jesus' parable there of the wheat and the tares, the left behind are the tares, the weeds. So the rapture has the people taken. By contrast, at the second coming of Christ, according to this chart, the wicked are taken. The wicked are taken, and the Christians are left behind. So notice the difference in the language. At the rapture, Christians are taken and the wicked are left, which means the Matthew 24, 30 through 41 or through 42 language where Yeshua is talking about they'll see the sign of the Son of Man coming in the clouds, gathering, the angels will go forth and gather all the people, and then two people will be in the middle, two people will be separated, one will be taken, one will be left. All of that language, according to this, I think it's John Ankerberg, that's the name that I said I was the Bible teacher who's a well-known end times Bible teacher, John Ankerberg. He did a show where he had two guests, both of them were doctors, and they were talking about the rapture and second coming, and this was the summary of what both of them were trying to emphasize. John Ankerberg, A-N-K-E-R-B-E-R-G, I believe it's not U-R-G, but E-R-G, Ankerberg. Well, the rapture described in Matthew chapter 24 uses the language of taken and left to indicate that the Christians and believers are taken and the wicked are left behind. But when we look at the details of the second coming, then it's the wicked who are taken in judgment and the Christians are left, which means the wheat and the tares, a parable given in Matthew 13, where the weeds are gathered together first, chronologically, by the angels and taken off to be burned, and then the wheat is gathered into the barn sequentially, then that would be an indication of the second coming and not the rapture. So Matthew 13, the parable of the wheat and the tares, is a parable about the second coming, versus Matthew chapter 24, which is not a parable, it's a narrative, it's prose, is a description of actual events. It's not a parable to try to that can only be understood by believers. Rather, it's referring to rapture. And so that was just another chart that we'll deal with in time, where it talks about 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Similar to what we've been talking about that, but we'll get to that in time. But I'll stop right here. That'll do it for our look at finally answering the question, who's taken and who's left. Which side do I agree with? Did I tell you? If you didn't catch it, I'll just tell you. I agree with this slide here. I believe that the event spoken of in Matthew 24 is rapture, and the Christians, the believers, will be taken, and the unbelievers will be left. So Matthew 24 is rapture. Contrasted with Matthew 13 is second coming language. The wicked are taken in that regard, meaning they're the ones that are dealt with first, sequentially, and they are gathered together so that they can be judged. They don't inherit the millennial kingdom. And then sequentially second, the Christians are the ones who are spared, that taken away in judgment, as it were. They're left behind so that these believers can inherit the kingdom of God, which is the millennial kingdom. So that's my perspective. But that'll do it for eschatology, a biblical study of end time events.